I don't have any explanations. I wish I could understand. You know, if you build theories about it, if you seek to find meaning in all this chaos. God knows I've tried. My family is insultingly boring. I don't say it in a bad way, on the contrary. That absence of problems gave us a life that was extremely quiet. We're not rich, but we've never missed anything. We don't have luxurious vacations, but we can visit the family at least once a year. My parents have a happy marriage. There's not much to tell. And I thought for a long time that we all had that simple life. In early 2014 I realized that it was not like that. And that's where this story begins. Curiously, everything came to light with a photography workshop. They made me choose someone in my family and take pictures of this character and his environment to try to capture the essence of his personality. Thinking of something interesting, I asked my grandfather to do it about him. Although my grandparents were, like us, extremely calm, that house of more than 150 years was already in itself a whole character. At least that's what I thought then. I took some photos of my grandfather and then it was time to eat. It was Saturday. Grandma prepared chicken broth for me, happy that I had visited them. Once, as a child, I told him out of courtesy that his chicken broth was very good, and since then he thought it was my favorite dish. Whenever he knew I would visit him, he would prepare it for me. It was so nice. On the street, there was suddenly a scandal. A boy had tried to enter to steal from the house of an old man near the corner. He did not count that day were all the children of the Lord, who chased him, and almost in front of my grandparents' house, they were beating him terribly. My grandfather was a very sensible man and went out to ask them to wait for the police. In the end, there is always the doubt of whether someone steals because they like easy money or out of necessity. That's what he always told us. I wanted to go out, but my grandmother stopped me. He asked me to wait inside and I had to get in like this, hearing the screams behind those huge wooden doors. That house looks more like a convent, an old hotel than a house, but it's always been family. From the main entrance to the street there are two corridors, one to the left for the bedrooms and another to the right for the kitchen, the dining room and the living room. In the center there is a door to a small central garden with a fountain of little angels that, from what I remember, has caused me a lot of fear. I finally decided to ignore the noise and continue with the photo assignment. I approached the angel, as always, with a little nervousness, and took some photographs. The light at that moment was perfect and suddenly, in the background, out of focus through the camera, I saw someone pass by my grandparents' bedrooms. I lowered the camera and I didn't see anything. But I decided to get closer to that side of the house, regularly always closed for visits. My grandparents for some reason have always slept in separate rooms, one door in front of the other at the end of the corridor. And in the background, in front of both doors, the entrance to a small little cellar that I had never entered. I thought that maybe it was time to do it. From the conversations I had heard, I understood that they kept old photos and things there, that at some point my mother used it as a studio and that, among other things, she kept the things that the old inhabitants of that house were leaving behind over more than 100 years. When I approached the door, I don't know how to explain it, I felt as if someone was calling me from within, and at the same time, as if someone was pushing me from the chest so that I wouldn't get any closer. Ernesto, the sound of someone calling my name behind my back, bloodied me. I was astounded. I just felt some hands take me by the shoulders and I screamed before I realized that it was my grandmother. He had never scolded me so much. He told me that I would not tell my grandfather, but he even asked me to leave the house at that time. He did not make chicken broth again on any of the next visits. That hurt me more than I thought. At the end of that year he died without forgiving me. And I didn't understand what I had done to bother her. She died on December 23rd. And that night of the 24th, while the families around celebrated, my mother was also gathered, but for another reason. At the funeral, we talked among the cousins. remembering the grandmother. Above all, we got together several, more or less the same age, the four of us who were in high school at that time. In the midst of memories, I told for the first time that conflict with my grandmother, that invasion of her innocent privacy on my part, but that it cost me my relationship with her those last months. They all agreed that it was not for so much. Suddenly the voice of Sarah, a cousin of just 12 years old who according to us was sleeping lying on her brother's legs, said something that would only complicate what she felt about it even more. She confessed that she had accidentally seen the interior of that room, permanently closed, since she had memory. It was, according to us, completely covered with religious figures, and in the center of the room there was a round table full of candles. We didn't believe him. If something our grandparents had, it was that they were not at all concerned about that type of religious figures, and they did not educate any of their children in the Catholic or Protestant religion in which they were educated in their families. We told him that he was surely mistaken, that he had imagined it or that he was inventing it. But his answer was clear. He said it even with his eyes closed, as if asleep. If you don't believe me, go see it now that the house is alone. We weren't far from the house, about 5 or 6 blocks, so we decided to go and end the curiosity. We told our parents that we were going to go for something to eat, and we asked the grandfather if he needed anything from his house. Still very afflicted, he told us not to go with the head. And he continued to contemplate the coffin immobile. We walked at a fast pace, and for some reason almost in silence I felt a hole in my stomach, and I wanted to tell you that we should forget about the matter, that it did not matter, although deep down I wanted to know what it was that made my grandmother bother so much with me. I'm not sure if there was no light on the street that night or if everyone decided to go spend the night somewhere else, but the street of my grandparents' house seemed more deserted than any, darker than any. We entered the house. We turned on the light. The silence was such that I could hear the light bulb. We headed nervously down the hall to the room. When I looked at that angel in the yard that terrified me, this time I saw him looking directly at me. I don't know if it was the little light that entered in my nerves, but I could barely see his face, and instead of his smile, what I saw in that face was an expression of terror or anger. But his mouth was completely open, or at least that's what I could guess in the gloom that covered him. Before I could think about what I thought I had just seen, we were in front of the door of that room. My 3 cousins, Christian, Giovanni, Alex and me. We opened the door. We find the image that Sarah had described minutes before. From the floor to the ceiling, the room was covered with religious images of all kinds. We don't even find the switch, but the light of the candles from that round wooden table. In the center, painted with a horrible blue sky, surely a long time ago, it illuminated enough to discover even Hindu images. We all turned around the room trying to discover what it meant, but while my cousins discussed, I could only think of one of the candles that was about to be consumed completely. The wooden gate sounded. Someone had arrived at the house. I ran out to the corridor from where I could see the entrance and the patio. It was my grandfather. I ran to tell the others, and we ran out of the corner when we saw the light in the corridor turn on. My grandfather was a few meters from us, about to see us. Christian and Giovanni barely managed to get into my grandfather's room. I lost sight of Alex, and I had to enter my grandmother's room trying to close it without making any noise. If she, my grandmother who was all sweetness, had bothered so much with me, I could not imagine what my grandfather would do if he realized that while we were watching over his wife we had betrayed his trust. The slow steps of the grandfather approached until they stood in front of the door to which I was stuck trying to hear. Suddenly I thought it was likely that I had gone to the house for something from my grandmother, or that I entered her room to remember her or something like that, and I quickly threw myself to the floor to get under the bed. He opened one of the other doors. I heard him. When I was about to peek and get out of under the bed, he entered the room. I could hardly hide. I saw his feet walk towards the center of the room, and I saw how he got on his knees. I thought I had seen him peek under the bed and I would get furious, but he just put his hand in trying to find something. He passed his hand very close to my face, but luckily it didn't touch me. When he touched a shoebox, he pulled it out. Then he left the room. He closed the door. I heard footsteps in the hallway, the door closing, and then how he moved away. Minutes later, Alex entered through me. He had to hide under the candle table. He couldn't do anything else. He saw how the ball entered with a candle. He lit it, left it, and then left. When I came in to see, I noticed that he changed the candle that was about to be consumed, the one I had focused on. There were 33 candles on that table, in a figure that I could not describe. It is not something I would have seen before, but it was too precise to be a coincidence. Now I was even more tormented with doubt. Evidently, we could not comment on it with anyone, but what the hell did all that mean in the room? Why did the grandfather take the time to go change a candle at home while the grandmother was lit? Why nobody, not even his last children, having used that room for other things, seemed to have an idea of what led the grandparents to make it so forbidden in that last time, when in August 2015 the health of the grandfather fell suddenly? What I thought least about was questioning about it. As soon as he got to the hospital, he died. And the family was almost happy that he was reuniting with his grandmother again. Alex was the last person who could talk to him. My mother told me when I got to the hospital, as my uncles passed as they got to the place, my cousin suddenly came in to see him. After a few minutes he left the room, and by the time my uncle Manuel came in, Grandpa had already left. I thought it was curious that it had been Alex, the most rebellious, the last one to see him. He was always very far from everyone, but when he was 14 years old, he confessed to the whole family that he was gay. The cousins, especially the closest ones, we already imagined it, and perhaps because of the age we accepted it without problems. But there were some uncles who, for some stupid reason, even stopped talking to him. At that time they were the grandparents, of whom we expected it less. Los que terminaron apoyándolo más así que algo en mí sintió que era lo correcto que él tuviera la oportunidad de escuchar las últimas palabras del abuelo. Sin embargo, minutos después me encontré a Alex y supe la verdad al respecto. Lo abracé, ambos teníamos lágrimas en los ojos y me pidió que lo acompañara a casa de los abuelos. I asked him what was going on, and he told me he couldn't explain it to me there in the hospital. I asked Christian to wait for him to get there, but he told me there was no time. We ran out, and he drove like he'd never seen him before to the house. On the way, he told me everything. It hadn't been a coincidence. My grandfather wanted to talk to him when he felt he didn't have much strength left. Between what Alex thought were inconsistencies, he clearly said that he saw it hidden that time in the room of the candles when he had to hide under the table. He repeated that it was not his fault or the grandmother's, and that they kept the 33 candles on, that it was not his fault or the grandmother's, and that they had to keep the 33 candles on. Those were his last words, one and again. I had asked him to leave at that moment to make sure they wouldn't turn off, and that's exactly what we had come to that house for. Although Alex told me I didn't have to do it, I was convinced that I also had to be there. I went in with him, and even though it was still early, the interior of the house, even the patio, it seemed to get darker and darker. I couldn't help looking at that angel, but I looked down this time. We ran to the candles room. There were several about to be consumed, but one had already disappeared completely. Alex asked me to help him find the others, and I remembered the shoebox under Grandma's bed. I left the room, and suddenly, at the end of the corridor, the figure of a girl with an almost alert position looked at us. Like that time of the angel, there was something that covered him completely, that made him only a silhouette and did not let me look at his face clearly. A very strange darkness. I began to paralyze little by little when I came to reason. And I started to accept that it was not one of my cousins, nor a neighbor, nor anything like that. I was seeing something that for some reason I knew had to do with that room behind me. That silhouette of a girl suddenly ran towards me, and I also ran in the same direction, but to run to my grandmother's room, take the box and run to the candles room again. We lit the one that was missing. We changed the others that were about to end and counted again that it was 33. Suddenly, we heard something like a deep sigh throughout the room, but we had no idea what the hell was just happening. We called Christian, and he came shortly after accompanied by Giovanni and Sarah, who insisted on accompanying them, as he could. Alex told them about Grandpa, and I tried to say what I had just seen in the hallway, but they didn't seem to pay attention to me. Suddenly, in the midst of sadness and confusion, a ghostly vision seemed like something silly to talk about. Only Sarah seemed to have paid attention to me. And while Giovanni and Christian tried to convince us that we were affected by Grandpa's death and that it was all a nervous crisis, Sarah walked without saying anything to the room of the candles. I yelled no when I realized what I was doing. He took a candle and came up to us, and with a whistle he put it out. Alex turned to her incredulous and shouted, "That's what I thought, that's what I thought." At that moment, Alex screamed, but I realized it was a sound. A sound that first looked like a scream, then a cry, and then something guttural. While we all turned around trying to identify the origin, it was changing to something even stranger, a kind of growling, so serious that we could feel the vibrations in the chest. When that sound fell, the light from the dining room lit up on the other side of the patio. And we saw a silhouette enter running. I was sure I had to be imagining it. That silhouette was impossible. At first glance, I could have sworn that it was a skinny man without a t-shirt, but as he ran and entered through the gate of the dining room, more than 2 meters 30 in height, that silhouette bent, as if it had not fit. I was about to ask the others if they had also seen it when Christian and Giovanni came out shooting at the door of the street. Alex ran to Sarah and lit the candle that was still in his hands. "I have to stay. I have to stay," Alex repeated, trying to calm down. When I asked him what he meant, his answer scared me, although I understood him. Until I didn't know what the hell was going on. Tendria que cuidarse nesa casa para asegurarse de que las 30 y tres velas estuvieran encendidas tal como lo dijo el abuelo y yo sabía que no podría dejarlo solo. Así comenzó lo que sería la semana más horrible de mi vida. Era un martes aproximadamente a las 6 de la tarde. Llegué con una maleta para acompañar a Alex que ya se había instalado desde esa mañana. Nobody seemed to care. All the uncles thanked us for the gesture of taking care of the house, with the exception of Uncle Manuel. It was said that the grandparents had decided to inherit the house from him for being the last to have left it and for being the only one who had not been able to buy a proper one. Something that others found unfair, even if they dared not say it, fearing that we were somehow trying to keep his inheritance or something like that. Uncle Manuel surprised us that same night when he arrived at dinner time and settled in the room of the grandmother. He took dinner for the three of them and tried to pretend that he had arrived at the house in a friendly way. His presence, more than making us uncomfortable, made us feel that it would not be possible to investigate more about the room and what we had seen the day the grandfather died. Even more so with him sleeping at a door there. We talked for a long time, the three of us, until midnight. And as in a movie, we were surprised by the sound of a clock that was in the hallway towards the bedrooms, but whose bells rang in every corner of the house. At that moment, as I was hiding among that sound, I heard clearly that something fell. It was a dry blow, like the one that someone had made falling from the bed. In my imagination, the sound came from the room of the candles, but it could well have come from one of the bedrooms, or from the others. My uncle seemed not to have noticed it, but my eyes met with those of Alex. He had also heard. Uncle Manuel got up in the kitchen, and Alex approached me. I changed several candles, but I kept them in the room of the grandmother. Habra que sacarlas de ahi. Note que se están consumiendo más rápido de lo normal. No sé qué pueda significar. Guardamos silencio cuando regresó mi tío. Se despidió de nosotros y se fue a dormir. Y nosotros dos nos acomodamos cada quien en un sillón. No sin centernos raros por lo que habíamos visto días atrás entrar ese mismo salón en el que ahora estábamos. We tried to sleep, but I could not stop looking towards the total darkness that was forming in the corners. Just when I was starting to fall asleep, when I felt my eyes heavy and for a moment I was starting to dream, a noise in the central patio made me open my eyes again. A loud noise, like something running through the pots, moving them. The window that connected that patio to the room where we were opened a little from the outside, and I clearly heard something jump, and I wanted to think it was a dream because I was terrified by the idea of the angel in the garden moving, and several times as a child I came to have nightmares where he chased me around the house. I felt so scared that my heart literally hurt. Then I looked at Alex from the other side of the room, with my eyes almost out of sight of terror, and making a sign that there was no noise. Immediately, and almost without moving my finger, he pointed to his right side in the corridor near the window. I'm sure of what I saw then. I swear by the memory of my grandparents. It was the silhouette of the angel looking at me, with that angelic smile guessing in the dark. Suddenly, in a jump, Alex stopped screaming and ran towards that silhouette, which disappeared in a movement running down the corridor. We listened to the steps with total clarity until we got lost in the bedrooms, then the door to the grandma's room where my uncle was. We ran and we found him buried in the corridor in the middle of the 3 doors. We asked him what was going on, and when he saw us, his face changed as if he had seen a ghost. Someone just got into his grandpa's room. I thought it was one of you. Meanwhile, I tried with all my strength not to look at the patio. For my bad luck, that figure in the center looked from all possible angles at the house. I think more than afraid to see him, at that moment, I couldn't stand the idea of turning and that his place was empty. We were like paralyzed the 3 until Alex slowly opened the door. It had opened just a few centimeters when someone pushed violently from inside. My uncle shouted in fright, perhaps all the rudeness that was known, and ran to the kitchen, screaming that he was going for a knife and that he would see who it was that was in there. Alex took the opportunity and opened the room of the candles. We saw that one of them was off. He ran to the room of the grandmother, took out the candles and turned on one by replacing the off one and put the others in a corner. Meanwhile, I heard a laugh coming from inside Grandpa's room, which fell suddenly. My uncle ran with me, taking off half a push and opening the door of Grandpa's room in a hit. He checked everywhere, but found nothing inside the room. We spent the next few hours until dawn, telling him everything that had happened since Grandpa's death. And the relationship we thought he had with the candles in that room. We have to go to sleep, said my uncle. In the afternoon we will think what to do. I spent half the afternoon since 11 in the morning when I woke up making a stop from one point to another in the city. For moments I forgot everything. For moments my life was like anyone else's, like the people around me, or that's what I wanted. Around 5 o'clock, I headed back to the center of the city, to the old neighborhood, thinking about what I saw at night at my grandparents' house. When I got to the gate, I ran into Doña Laura, a lady who helped my grandparents with the housework during their last years. She gave me her blessing and moved away, in a hurry. When I entered, Alex and my uncle had gallons of water on the dining table, strange artifacts, crucifixes and Bibles. They scared Mrs. Laura, I said. No, she brought all this, said Alex. I just thought that didn't look good. I asked them what I had told them, and my uncle Manuel said that I wasn't worried, that they were incoherences and fantasies of the lady. En serio le pregunté después de todo lo que nos ha pasado aquí, vamos a decir que la señora tiene fantasías dice que son duendes, dijo Alex, dice que las ha visto correr del patio al cuarto de las velas. Ella tampoco sabe que onda con esa habitación cuando llegó a ayudarles a los abuelitos, ya la tenían así. Crucé la casa hasta la sala para dejar mis cosas. That sound of the elves was absurd. But in that house, in that place, in those circumstances, the thought of anything out of the ordinary was enough to terrify me. and that damn angel smiled at me. In his normal position but with something different on his face. Ernesto, come on, let's do an experiment. Look at this. I didn't like at all how those words sounded like Alex's. They opened the door to the room of the candles. My uncle took one of the small ones from a nozzle and turned it off. The lights flickered for a moment, as if there was an overload of electricity, and the flames of the candles trembled as if someone was breathing near them. I felt a cold on my back as if coming from the long corridor. Despite the lights being on, due to the shape of its construction, the house always kept its corners, and particularly dark corners. Nothing happened. Before my Uncle Manuel could finish that sentence, steps on the ceiling were heard. Very strong steps that planted the walls around us. In an attack of nerves, my uncle turned on the candle and left it on the table. It didn't take 2 seconds for the steps to stop listening. They want us to have them on. Let's leave them like this, said my uncle. Whatever they are, they get angry when we turn off the candles. Tomorrow I'm going to call the priest. He closed the room with a key and took his things. Stay here in the house if you want, but don't get in here. I'll see you tomorrow. Saying that, as soon as he arrived, he left. Alex, however, seemed not to have paid attention. He seemed focused. I don't think they get angry at the candles. At first I didn't understand why he whispered. What? I asked him. I don't think they get angry at the candles. I think they'd prefer them off. Don't you think? I don't understand the truth. I told him. There were 2 more candles about to end, at least the ones I could see from here. Let's see what happens in a while if they turn off. Saying that, he went back to the kitchen and started pouring holy water all over the house. I no longer knew to what extent I was sure to stay there, but I knew I couldn't leave him alone, so I called Christian. The truth, the only truth, is that I didn't want to be alone. Christian, angry, accepted to go, although he was very afraid. I arrived at about 10. There are many things to do in the store, he said, and I knew it was not a pretext. Christian helped his father attend to a small cafeteria they had. Uriel, you have the address. I gave you the address of the house. I know that everything is very difficult to believe, but what happened that night, in particular, what I am about to say, can be confirmed by the people who live next door to the house. You can go ask whenever you want. We had bread and milk dinner when Christian arrived, a little later than he had promised. He tried to convince us to leave. That we let Uncle Manuel deal with that if he wanted to stay with the house. It's not about what's left, but what it was, said Alex. This was the grandparents' house. We all have memories here. To-dos. It is everyone's. Not whatever comes out of that room. We arrived first. Or maybe not, Christian replied. Maybe it was there before. We were silent for a while and tried to finish dinner. A while later, a deep sigh seemed to come out of the room from the candles. There are some about to finish, Alex said to Christian. We want to see what happens if we leave her like this. A murmur then began to travel the house. Alex and Christian walked towards the corridor, and I got up to leave my plate in the sink. And when I got there, it was clear. The murmur became stronger. It seemed to come out of the pipes. I don't know if it was in another language or if I wasn't able to understand it, but I couldn't stop looking at the pipe. I took off the mesh that has as protection and the murmur fell for a moment, as if they had surprised him. Then, a moment later, it continued as if nothing had happened, and I could almost see an eye close from inside. It's my imagination, I thought, and nervous, I walked down the hall to look for my cousins. Then I realized that someone had turned off all the lights. Only in the kitchen, where I was there light. Another sigh came out of the room. The other candle, I thought, and ran towards the hall. When I turned around, to go to the living room and corridor area, I saw what appeared to be a woman running towards me. A woman dressed as a bride. Again, I tell you, it was very dark and could be anything. I just remember that instead of going right, I turned to the right, for the vestibule that led to the street, and I went out it. I would have liked for everything to change at that moment, for everything to end and life to continue normally, but the truth is that the heavy and gloomy atmosphere seemed to sink everything outside, seemed to fill the entire street. All I could think of was running to the neighbor in front of me, Patricia. She didn't say anything, she was very confident. It wasn't enough to knock on her door at 11:30 at night, but at that moment I didn't know what else to do. Patricia had been successful in the United States since she was old enough to work. She had saved enough to buy a property on that street when she returned to the country, and restore it little by little. He was not even 35 years old and he was already fulfilling his dream. I repeat, I was very quiet, and at that moment it was my only way to find an escape from the house. When he opened the door, I realized that I had not thought of any excuse. I called him because I had lost mine, I told him, and I needed to make a call. He told me to go to what he was looking for on his cell phone. I noticed his discomfort for the hour, but there would be time later to apologize. She asked me how I had lost my cell phone, and I told him that the light had gone out at the grandparents' house. "Well, look, it's back," she told me, pointing to the window of a room that faced the street, a room that also remained closed most of the time and that the grandmother used to weave, one of her most ingrained hobbies. Her silhouette, the silhouette of the grandmother, was perfectly drawn at that moment using the sewing machine. It looked so clear through the curtain that it seemed to have had a reflector behind it. The silhouette suddenly turned towards us, and from the door of the house I saw Alex and Kristen shooting at us. The silhouette stopped and changed completely. I can assure you that she had that wedding dress, which was the woman who had seen moments before in the corridor. Although Patricia knows nothing more about what happened those days, and evidently we did not get to share everything, she is a witness to what happened at that moment, of that silhouette, and besides that she spent the whole night in that room. And that night, none of us could return. My mom went to pick up some things at home. I didn't find out until late afternoon. I asked her why she had left without telling me anything, and she answered that she didn't need to let me know when she went to her parents' house. Evidently, I couldn't answer anything. My mom had been with my cousin Sarah all morning and they had both left. "Didn't you see anything strange?" I asked. "Besides the disaster you left?" "Nothing." "Yes, the whole house felt very cold. And I already saw what the grandparents did with the room they were talking about. It's scary. And it's a danger to have so many candles lit there," she answered me. I asked him about the candles. And my mom told me that Sarah had entered and lit some. She told me as something unimportant, without knowing everything it meant for us. And at that moment I sent a message to Sarah through Facebook to ask her what had happened and why the hell. She hadn't told me anything. "I go early to the grandparents' house with my brother," he answered. "See you there." I arrived at the grandparents' house very early, at about 7 in the morning. The old ladies who lived on the street made their traditional cleaning in front of their houses, a moment that they commonly took the opportunity to talk. In the air, the breeze of the morning was still breathing. For a moment, standing in front of the door without daring to enter, I missed my grandmother as never before. Even when I saw the opaque window of the living room that I used to weave, I could still see her figure, like every time I visited her. The sound of the door of Patricia's house called me to open it, and when I saw her come out, I approached her to apologize for the strange way I behaved with her the other night. "Patty, excuse me for what happened the other night, really. I'd like to be able to explain to you, but it's complicated," I said. She smiled at me and said she wouldn't worry and promised we'd talk later. We never did. She walked out the banquet to the main street, and from her door came Mrs. Marta, her mother. I also wanted to apologize to her for being afraid to have woken her up that night. "I'm not going to tell her why I did it, ma'am, but do you think I'm not going to believe you?" She interrupted me. Before I knew what to answer, she told me that the neighbors had been commenting things about the grandparents' house for years, but she always thought they were superstitions of older people. I don't know what's going on there or what you're bringing with Alejandro these days, he continued, but I hope you know that your grandmother is still there in the house. I don't know if she's angry with you or taking care of you, but she's there in the house. I froze. I got cold. I turned to his window again, and there, in the darkness, between the opaque, I could almost see his face. And I knew that maybe I was imagining it, that it was my desire to see her, but deep down I was sure that it was or wasn't what I was seeing. My grandmother was still there. Lady Martha told me that she could see her passing through the windows that led to her house, and that she was never afraid of her, but a strange fascination because she was a skeptic until then. The scandal that is brought to me on Wednesday woke me up. When you touched Patty, he said. I looked out the window to see that everything was fine. When your cousins went out running with you, behind them, I could see your grandmother. It was the first time I saw her as if she were made of flesh and bone. Until then, I had only been able to see her silhouette in the windows, just when Mrs. Martha told me that. I went around the street to Christian's car. He stopped in front of the house and let Sarah and Giovanni go down. He made me a sign that we should wait for him while he was looking for a place to park before entering. I said goodbye to Mrs. Marta, doubting if what she had just told me was something I should share with my cousins. I had many doubts if my grandmother was there to take care of us, or if she was being forced to stay at home, to stay there and live among those things that had taken over the place. Sarah told us that she had heard her mother talking on the phone the night before. Apparently, Uncle Manuel had made the decision to sell the house as soon as his name was there, something that did not leave the others at all satisfied. Come on, I want to see something before Alex arrives, Christian told us, and we went to the house. From the patio, the angel received us, macabre as always, but I noticed that this time I was not the only one who tried not to look at him. Every time we turn off a candle, something comes, I told them. And just when I pronounced those words, something, an terrifying idea, passed through my head. And if my grandmother was suffering, and if I needed to light another candle for her? So she could rest. At that moment we realized that Sarah was not with us, and we started looking for her all over the house. Finally we found her turning her legs up to the kitchen, completely. She was looking for something, and finally she had found it. It was a worn-out card from Don Fidel, the man who did all the repairs to the house. Sarah explained to us that the day before a 16-year-old boy had passed by there who talked to my mom. From the street door he kept looking in to see inside. And he asked her specifically if everything was fine and if they needed repairs in the room at the bottom of the bedrooms. He said he was Don Fidel's son, so something. I had to know. Sarah left in a hurry when she told us that. To my surprise, Alex was already waiting for her outside, and they moved away quickly while Sarah marked the number of the card on her cell phone. Let's go, said Giovanni, calling our attention again. We have to see if this is true. I knew Giovanni needed to see it too, that it was difficult for him to commit to what we said the others, and tried to investigate if he had not seen something also sufficiently resounding as to rule out any rational explanation. I was somewhat tired, the truth. I could not sleep in those days, and I did not need to see anything else to believe in what was happening. I told them that I would lie down for a while in the room while they did their experiments. I knew they were going to turn off the candles and wake up, so to speak, some of the things that we had already seen, so I took one of the blankets that we had left in the salt, and with a lot of fear, I placed it on the garden angel. Almost as soon as I lay down on the couch, I fell deeply asleep. I began to dream of many strange things that I remember were terrifying to me, but that I forgot when I woke up, between dreams, between nightmares. I felt someone shaking me, someone pulling me violently to wake me up. I thought it was one of my cousins, that something was happening, but when I opened my eyes, I saw a woman with horrible black hair covering her whole face. A woman who shook me while she was above me. At that moment I felt, I swear, that my heart stopped working. I closed my eyes and tightened them, and in that instant I stopped feeling her over me. I have to say that of all the things that happened there during this week, this is one of the ones that made me feel the most danger, but at the same time it is the one that continues to cause me some doubts. I know very well that it could have been treated as sleep paralysis, but what happened next, however, with all certainty, I know that it is totally real. The light that entered through the window, getting more and more dim, and through the direction, made me turn to look at my watch. And it was that hours had passed, already at more than 4 in the afternoon. I slept much longer than I thought. Next to me, on the floor, was the blanket I had placed on the angel. How much did I see her? I ran like a soul that takes the devil to the area of the rooms, shouting at my cousins, but none responded. When I got to that room, there were 5 candles off. I didn't know how many, but I hurried to light them and replace them with those that were already finished. When I did it, a cry from the grandfather's room caught my attention. Worried because he knew nothing of my cousins, I entered the room. The weeping came from under the bed. I watched him from there standing and had no idea of what was below me. I bent down, and when I raised my head I realized that it was Christian, who was hidden under the bed and who did not stop crying, as if he were a child. I picked him up and asked him what had happened. He did not stop asking me about Giovanni. We went out into the street. I left him in the small barred store that was a few meters from the house, and I went back to look for my other cousin. I went all over the house, but there was nothing. Nothing but a horrible stink that flooded him from corner to corner. When I came back with Christian, he told me he had just spoken to Giovanni's mother. He was already at home. This is very strange because I never knew what happened to Giovanni since that day. Seriously, I didn't see him again, and months later he moved out of the city saying he was going to go study in Guadalajara, but he didn't even go to university. Even today, he doesn't. I lost almost all contact with him because he doesn't even connect to Facebook anymore. Christian's, however, was very different, but we'll get to that. I received a call from Alex, after spending the whole afternoon looking for him and convincing him. He managed to talk to Don Fidel's son. Mr. Don Fidel refused to talk to Alex or Sarah, but the son was a little more understanding when he saw his desperation. It is very important that you do not stay in the house after it gets dark, but please check that the candles are in order and leave, Alex told me, although as I told them I had just turned them on, a great doubt began to enter me. And if there was any about to go out and I had not seen it, now that I think about it, it was completely unreal, but at that moment I felt that something could happen. So I went back and quickly entered the house. I turned on the lights. Sadness invaded me, thinking that now I would be so terrified to enter a place that was my second home for so long. A place where I had so many memories. I don't know if it was sadness or fear, but I felt clearly that something was oppressing my chest. The candles were in order. But something told me that one could fall, cause an accident, a fire. It's very strange, I know, it's very difficult to explain, but it's almost as if a voice put all those doubts in my head. Although I don't remember a voice telling me that. I put a bucket of water and put it under the table. If something happened, it would be useful that there was water, right? At least that was my logic. I went for a glass of water and I also put it on the table, and then I went for another, and I also put it, and then another, and then one more, and I lost the notion of how many I had taken until, when I took one more, and I stopped, I saw that the table was full of glasses as well as of candles, and behind it, behind the table, was the most horrible figure I have ever seen in my life. There, standing at the back of the room, was a man, or something with a humanoid shape, who seemed to be completely covered with what seemed to be a serp or something like that. It was as if it were full of scales, and although in his head I could not distinguish any human faction, I guessed a smile on him when he saw me, and with that smile he made a movement with his hand, with which he turned off 2 candles from the table. I ran out. It was such a clear, precise, sharp figure, like nothing I had ever seen in my life. As clear as I can see the computer at the time of writing this. When I ran outside, I noticed something in the patio, a figure next to the angel. And I saw it only with a glance, but it was a silhouette that was almost. I could almost swear that it was my grandfather. My grandfather sitting next to the fountain as he used to do, but this time he bent over as if to touch his stomach, as if it hurt. When I saw that and I was about to turn to see him in front, it seemed that the figure of the angel approached him as if to hug him. It's all I remember, and then I woke up in Christian's car. I don't know how I got to him, but I did it in worse conditions than he was a while ago. I don't even know how, but after a few minutes we got to his girlfriend's house, who had a party or a meeting there. We stayed in the place, in silence, in shock, but somehow we felt protected, at least that's how we felt, for being in the middle of a lot of people who lived their lives totally normal. We spent the night there. On Saturday afternoon we met with Alex at my house. He had gone to the grandparents' house to check that room before and said that, whatever it was, he felt worse and worse. Christian at that time apologized to us and told us that he could not or wanted to move on, and would not allow Sarah to do it either. Alex then decided not to tell Christian what he now knew and gave us an idea at least clearer of what was happening in the place, or at least what had caused it. If he doesn't want to get involved in this anymore, it's okay. Really, Christian doesn't need to live knowing it, he told me. Later he told me the story the next day. It was very important that my uncle Manuel would finally go with a priest to the house, a known priest who he had managed to convince to give a visit and bless her after the masses of that day. We're going to go too, Alex told me, and that Saturday night, the saddest I remember in my life, while we were drinking coffee, he told me the story. Don Fidel showed himself reluctant to tell the story from the first moment he realized that he had not been called to offer him a job. Only then had they got his address. However, it was evident that he knew exactly what Alex was referring to when he asked him for the house on that street. The house of the Abuelitos. He knew very well also that both grandparents had died, and later we found out that it was he himself who asked his son to check how everything was going. But for some reason he refused to share what he knew with my cousins, perhaps foreseeing them almost as the children. After leaving his house disappointed and thinking that he would not achieve anything, they ran into Don Fidel's son, who was returning from doing a small job. An illness of his father had been slowly diminishing his ability to go out to work, and the young man was taking care more and more completely of the family business of repairs and simple maintenance services. For this reason, even being then extremely young, almost a child, he had had to know exactly what happened in the house of the grandparents, which very probably would unleash everything that came after. It all started as a routine repair. A house as old as that needed constant maintenance, so it was not strange that the grandparents would talk to Don Fidel every time a new breakdown appeared. This, however, was going to require more heavy work, especially when breaking a floor and digging, so Don Fidel took his son and two of his assistants to help him that weekend. Suddenly, after digging almost a meter looking for where a leak in the pipes reached, they found a small chest. And once in the patio they had found things of value buried, something common in houses that had gone through the revolution. As on that other occasion, they would wait for the grandparents to open the chest and check it. However, when they took it out, below they noticed other things covered with fabrics. A little further down, a more chest and more bags of fabric that contained something inside. When the grandparents arrived, they entered that room to check, and Don Fidel asked his son and his assistants to leave. The boy, disobeyingly, stood watching through a window sill. When they began to discover what was wrapped in the fabric, the expression of the grandparents went from expectation to concern and then almost disgust. They continued to take things out of the bags of fabric one by one, and they were placed on that old wooden table. He, the boy, could not see what they were taking out, and eventually they reached the two small chests. The scream of the grandmother, when opening the first of them, must have flooded the entire block. The scare made the boy run to the garden. He hid behind the angel. And there he saw how the grandmother ran and headed to the other side of the house, towards the kitchen, and there he began to speak on the phone. The boy, waiting that he did not see him, approached the room again, but now he came across the door already closed. He only heard the grandfather say over and over again inside, "It cannot be, it cannot be," and he also heard his father Don Fidel asking the grandfather to calm down. When the other two assistants returned from their rest, Don Fidel asked them to leave and his son to wait in the kitchen a while. That little while they had promised him became hours until it darkened, and then several men arrived at the house. Because of the familiarity with which they spoke, the boy believed that they were friends of the grandfather, who shortly after came out carrying with them everything they had found. And Don Fidel told his son that it was time to go home. He did not say a word in the car, but in the middle of the road he stopped in the middle of a dark street and got off. There Don Fidel vomited, screamed, and with his eyes full of tears he returned to the car, again, without saying a word, not even a look. When they arrived at his house, he only asked his son to enter and not to tell his mother anything, and he stayed in the car. After a while he entered and went directly to the bedroom without dinner. This was all the boy knew with certainty, but small comments he heard later, conversations between his parents, loose words, made him suspect about what he had found on that occasion. They were hands. They looked like a mummy. They were real. They were human. That thing that was there, seemed to have the shape of a baby. Phrases that were lost, words without connection that he heard his father say, asleep while he had nightmares. The young man told them, "I don't know what they found there. My father returned to finish that job alone, and since then he got sick. Until then I had to go to me to make repairs in that house, but I never knew what happened. I never really knew what they found. But I know they woke up something, that since then everything has changed." While Alex told me what the boy had told him, I could not stop looking at him surprised. I never imagined the grandparents in that situation, dealing with that kind of thing, they who were so calm. But I did not understand why Alex started to cry while he was sharing what they had just told him. To tell the truth, there seemed exaggerated to me, as if out of place. "What's going on, Alejandro? It's not that bad," I said. He looked at me seriously and answered me. "I spoke to my mother." The grandmother told him at some point in confidence the stories of those who lived before in the house of the grandfather's family. "I don't know if you want to know, Ernesto. They are things that for one reason they never shared with their children, except with their grandchildren." When he told me that, I knew that there was no turning back. So I asked him to do it. And Alex told me then about our ancestors. He told me things from the occultism that some practiced at the beginning of the 20th century there, to the passage of the revolution that was terrible for thousands of people in the country trapped in the middle of two fires, of two sides that were not going to give in or concede anything, and those who did not care about the innocents. Then he told me stories of the 40s and 50s, that time of supposed progress for the country, and in which our house, seemed to stay in time. There were several stories so incredible that they were even shared in chronicles of the time. One of them was the revenge that a soldier swore against his patron, a merciless peasant who tortured the peons and raped his women. When the revolution broke out, a young peon who had seen how that horrible man tortured his older brother to death, swore that he was going to kill him and that he would do with his daughter what he did to dozens of women. About to fall into the hands of the raised, this boss managed to escape with his little one with the help of one of the nannies of the girl. This man, even as evil as he was, had very good friends of trust in this city. Among those friends was my grandfather's family. He asked them to hide in the house, but they refused. They told him that it was impossible for them to put the whole family at risk just for him. They agreed, however, to stay with his daughter until he found another place to put her safe. Weeks later, they had to abandon the house to take refuge in another city because it was too dangerous for them to stay there, but when they left, this girl did not appear anywhere. They searched for hours around the house and the street, they asked around the houses, but no one saw her. Being impossible to wait, they left. When they could eventually return, almost a year later, they dug up walls and windows and found themselves with the little girl's corpse, but she was no longer 2 months old. This, according to the doctor, meant that she had spent months completely alone, feeding on who knows what, in complete darkness, in complete agony. In that same house, in the 30s, an older sister of her grandfather had left school at an early age. She was kept in that room in the back, isolated from everyone else. Over time, the brothers began to worry. She screamed at night, cried all day asking to be let out, and when finally the parents allowed it, it was only to keep her in a convent. The brothers never heard from her again. When I heard the stories, I made in my head the Alejandro and I had made connections, though neither of us dared to say them aloud. He told me many more stories, stories shared in a context far removed from the paranormal, tales his mother told him as quirks of people from another time. But for us, it was all terrifying. Every detail seemed significant. When we arrived at my Uncle Manuel's house, 2 priests were already there. We spoke for a while, finding it strange how understanding they were, and how they didn't seem to question our accounts of the things we had experienced. "You'd be surprised the things we have to deal with," one of the priests, the older one, told us. The other, whom I remembered seeing at my grandmother's funeral dressed in civilian clothes, was very serious but seemed to know more. He told us that my grandmother had confided in him about certain things that were happening in that house. I know that at some point things started to happen here, and that the holy water and what I came to do to help them was not enough for them. Then his grandmother resorted to something else, to another type of beliefs, and told me very suddenly, hoping to forgive her. Confused, we looked at him. Noticing, he clarified, "Don't worry, your grandmother was not precisely Catholic or religious, so it is not a secret of confession or anything like it because she shared it with me in a talk. But I think it is now more important that you be clear what was already happening then." They proceeded to bless the house and pray in each of the rooms, but he was very clear, "This we have already done." And then it didn't work. Although we were going to do it, Alex asked me to not tell him anything about what we had discovered to my Uncle Manuel. After the priests left, my uncle asked us to stay for coffee. He told us he had a plan, he had to stay that night, and he would thank us if we also dared to do it. Before accepting, he told us, "Wait for the others to arrive." Then he left the house for a moment, returning with a woman, a girl of about 30 years, very, very short-haired and short-haired. She was carrying a board with her. At first glance, you would have said that it was a wig, but like none that I had seen before. "Make yourselves at home," my uncle said. "Prepare what is necessary." Alex asked them what was happening, and then someone saying my name caught my attention. I was in the living room, and that voice seemed to come from the kitchen, which was completely dark. "Ernesto." I heard it clearly again. Someone said my name, so I approached slowly, and barely illuminated by the moonlight that was coming in through a window sill, I could see the silhouette of a woman. A familiar silhouette. "Ernesto," my uncle called. "Please go for something to eat," while we started preparing everything. He gave me some bills, and I left stunned, still hearing that voice that came from the kitchen and that somehow I could feel in my whole body. I remember well, very, very well, that when I came back with the food in the house street of my grandparents, just 40 or 50 meters from me, I could see a beautiful silhouette. The silhouette I had seen in the kitchen. The silhouette of my grandmother. But young and thin, as I had not known her. The light of the lamp in the street that was right in the middle of us was strong enough to blind me and hide it. Hide her behind that light, but I could see her. She was there, standing, just looking at me. As soon as I thought of talking to her, I just thought of it. She turned around and disappeared completely in the dark. That was the last time I saw her, or felt her. I'm not sure of anything that happened in this stage of our life, but of the few, very few certainties that I have, is that that day, my grandmother and I were at peace, and that she made me see that in some way, she was no longer linked to that house, or to those candles and everything that inhabited it, and seeing her finally outside, was a total tranquility for me. When I entered, I was surprised to see that Alex, my uncle Manuel and the youngest priest who had been with us in the afternoon, were watching the girl from the outside preparing her table in the room of the candles. Do you really think it's a good idea to play the Ouija here? I asked them very angry. It's not an Ouija, my uncle said as he took me off my shoulder. And well, to this day I don't know what it was. But surely someone of you will know better what that table is in a very similar way. As I understand it, more than to have contact with spirits and to answer your questions, this other table is like a tool to lead the dead, to provide support from this spiritual plane. We are going to give this a chance, Alex told me, according to what the priest told us. The last time between my grandparents Don Fidel and the mother of that girl who now began to light incense had managed to contain in that room that whatever it was that had begun to invade the house since they found the chests. Almost everything is ready, the girl said. At 12 we will begin. I don't know if the girl really knew what she was doing, but there was a mixture of practices that disconcerted me. We heard Gregorian songs, Our Fathers, and Latin prayers, religious figures of all kinds, and a box of candles that threw a horrendous plague, even when they were off. This is going to take a long time, he told us. With these candles I will try to attract what this house inhabits, a candle for each presence. But these candles are of living flesh, and when they are off they will not appear here again, living flesh. I don't know what he meant, but that was the expression that was tattooed on my memory. The father gave us his blessing and said he would be nearby, on the street, in case we needed something from him. I assumed then that we had crossed the limits of what even a modern and liberal priest like him could tolerate. The girl asked my uncle Manuel to take a candle from the room and then go out with her. When I tell you, you're going to turn it off, she said. My uncle entered nervously. He came out seconds later with a candle, and walked towards the entrance of the house. Apagala, turn it off, the woman said. And my uncle did it with a puff. The tallow candles that the woman brought did not light. He put one in another match and they were consumed before they could be lit. I heard my uncle scream, and then how he ran to the street. A little later, he would tell us that while standing in the receiver when he turned off the candle, suddenly his reflection in the mirror began to become more opaque, to the extent of being just a stain. While we were being heard each time as if we were further away, that stain that was his reflection suddenly turned into a woman in black, who in a blink of an eye was in front of him, trying to take it from his chest. The candle lit up moments later. That's why he escaped to the street, where everything seemed to return to normal. The candle lit up moments later, and then it was my turn. It was actually Alex's turn, but I was so scared that I wanted to end it as soon as possible. So I took a candle and left. I froze in the corridor, although my initial plan was to run to the kitchen, one of the most illuminated places in the house. Before the woman gave me the indication, something turned off my candle. I don't know if it was a stream of air or if it was something else, but when I walked down that dark corridor, I noticed again that the silhouette of the angel was beginning to move away from its place, and I was petrified. I noticed again that when I walked again, when I took one more step, this thing moved again. It only did it while I was walking, and then I also saw next to him sitting in that fountain the silhouette of my grandmother, and every step I took that thing got closer and closer to her, but something inside me told me that my grandmother was safe, that my grandmother was out of there arming me with courage. Instead of running straight to the kitchen, I turned around to run right to the patio, right to the figure of the angel. And when I saw it from the front, I realized that the figure was in its place, that there was no one else there, that everything was perhaps in my head. Alex told me to come back. The candle was already on, He entered the room then, took a candle and left. I noticed that it was a slightly heavier candle, one that was in the center and one that I had not remembered to change. I barely fit him between my hands. And I remember very well his look at Alex's look, barely illuminated by that candle. He looked at me and smiled, as if he were a child about to make a mischief. As if for a moment it were not him. The lights were off. The only thing that allowed us to see a little further beyond our eyes was the light of the candles inside the room and the whispers of the woman trying nervous to light the candle she was carrying. Suddenly she screamed, and her veil fell to the floor, breaking. Extremely strong and heavy steps, like that of a huge animal, were heard in the room. In the shadow caused by the candles, I could see something like, let me say, a male goat. As if it were standing in the middle of the room. A rustle was heard and all the candles in the room went out. We were in complete darkness. Have you heard that recording of the sounds of hell? That sound that they recorded unintentionally in an excavation several kilometers deep. Something very similar began to sound from inside my head at that moment. While Alex and I illuminated with matches, while we ran to the room, before closing the door, I saw how the hallway was filled with figures of blurred silhouettes walking slowly towards us, when the light of a candle was lit behind me. I could swear that one of the figures stopped. I don't know if that happened to the others, but I closed the door. And what I had just seen made me dizzy, because they were like people out of focus, as if I couldn't see them completely. We lit one by one, not just 33 candles, but all of them that were in the room. Of the horrible smelling candles that the woman took, we could only light 18. We never found the others. Nothing was ever the same. The woman told us that she did not know how to solve the problem after that attempt, and asked us not to call her anymore. If he had to go to that house, the father who was supposed to be outside, vanished. I never knew it was him or if he was even a real priest. My uncle Manuel inherited the house, and before they were even in real life, I was already renting it as an office for a government dependency. I don't know if with everything in that room, I don't know if the candles are still there. And that dependency lasted very little there, so the house is empty again. My uncle never told anything about what happened, and when Alex dared to do it, my uncle Manuel denied everything, leaving Alejandro as a liar. Worse still, as an unbalanced. Alejandro was actually treated for bipolar disorder, depression, and the last thing my aunt told me is that they were starting to give him common medicines for patients suffering from schizophrenia. I never denied anything he said, but they didn't ask me directly either. And after seeing how they treated him, I decided not to tell anything between the family. Only some of my closest friends know. Sarah continues to make comments about it, but her character is so sarcastic that no one seems to take her seriously. I've seen Alex so badly recently. And my uncle Manuel seems to ignore everything so easily that I have asked myself more than once how much it was really, how much happened in my head. Maybe I should go back and see that room. Sarah's constant calls of attention remind me that we were actually witnesses to something terrible. I'm sorry to say this, but I think I have to do it. After a very clumsy suicide attempt, everyone, except Sarah and Alex, started treating me differently. I can't explain it to you. I would lie to you if I said I tried it because of what happened, because of what I tell in this story, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I feel that in some way this influenced a percentage, even if it is very small. Things in my life entered a terrible stage, and since that we spent in that room I feel as if something consumed my energy, as if something constantly day by day consumed my energy.